Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. In the cool, humid evenings of Port Harcourt, where the air often smelled of rain and roadside suya, Lena Abaca carried herself like someone who had learned early how to walk through fire without raising her voice. Her life was a straight line, clean, quiet, focused. People who knew her said she was the type of woman who didn't just believe in order, she embodied it. 35 years old, always punctual, her voice firm yet warm, Lena had built a reputation at the Rivers Biomedical Institute as one of the most thorough virologists in the region. In a field where margin for error could cost lives, she was the woman everyone trusted to catch what others missed. But it wasn't just in the lab that Lena thrived. She managed her household with that same microscopic attention to detail. Her marriage to Greg Abaca was considered solid, admirable even. Neighbors often said the two were like a pair of tightly woven threads in a fine cloth, nothing out of place. Church members referred to them as brother and sister Abaca, not just out of formality, but from the image of spiritual balance they represented. Greg was mild, polite, and often carried a quiet charm that made him well-liked without being flashy. He ran a small media consultancy downtown, and though his business didn't command the same structure as Lena's career, he seemed content playing second fiddle. Their love had no fireworks, but it had rhythm, a gentle, predictable beat like a well-practiced hymn. They prayed together at night, took turns cooking Sunday lunch, and split chores like partners in a quiet dance. Lena had no reason to question anything, and for someone whose world was built on structure, that felt like enough. She didn't need grand gestures. She just needed peace, and Greg gave her that, or so she believed. The apartment they shared in the GRA Phase 2 axis was a modest but tastefully arranged 3-bedroom unit with large windows, marble floors, and an open kitchen that looked onto the living area. It was Lena's sanctuary, a safe place where she hung up her lab coat and laid down the weight of the world. She often worked late into the evening, tapping away on her laptop while Greg read on the couch, sometimes sharing jokes about odd patient samples or strange office politics. At night, they would sometimes lie in bed talking about starting a family, not with desperation, but with a soft sense of timing, like people waiting for the rain to stop before stepping into the street. Lena wasn't in a rush. She believed life unfolded when it should, and God, in all his mysterious timing, would make things bloom when the soil was ready. That was how she had always lived, waiting, trusting, moving carefully. Her spiritual life wasn't loud or dramatic, it was consistent, deep-rooted. She prayed not just for blessings, but for discipline. She wasn't the kind to post scriptures online or make scenes during worship. Lena's faith was like water, calm, essential, and ever-flowing. And in that quiet devotion, she thought her marriage was protected. Greg never showed signs of restlessness. He complimented her when she changed her hairstyle. He asked about her day. He even remembered her mother's birthday without reminders. If anything troubled him, he never said. And if Lena had moments of doubt, they were fleeting, like clouds passing over an otherwise clear sky. The truth is, Lena had spent so long curating a peaceful life that she could no longer imagine herself in chaos. She believed the absence of noise was proof of happiness. But sometimes silence doesn't mean peace, it means something is hiding. Things began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, like a room losing oxygen one breath at a time. Greg became unusually tired in the evenings. He started taking longer phone calls outside the living room, excusing himself with casual smiles. He changed his cologne twice in 2 weeks, something he had never done before. Lena noticed, but didn't confront him. She wasn't the suspicious type. Besides, there were big changes happening at work. Her unit had just received funding for a new viral diagnostics program, and she had been placed in charge. The project demanded everything from her: early mornings, late nights, meetings with federal health officials, lab samples from across the state. Greg seemed proud of her. At least, that's how he behaved. He often brought her tea during her late-night research sessions. He told her how smart she was, how lucky he felt to be married to someone who mattered in society. Lena clung to these gestures like anchors. But in hindsight, even anchors can pull you down if the ship has started to sink. One Sunday afternoon, while folding laundry, Lena caught a whiff of an unfamiliar perfume on Greg's shirt. Not her scent, not his regular cologne. Something soft and fruity. She stared at the shirt for a few seconds before tossing it aside. Later, she would remember this moment, but at the time, she dismissed it. Greg had hugged a lot of people at church that day. It could have been anyone. That was the thing about Lena. Her mind was wired to explain away small inconsistencies. She was a woman who searched for logic before suspicion. But in doing so, she missed the early signs of erosion. It was during this slow unwinding that Marla James re-entered her life like a bird returning to a windowsill it once nested on. Lena hadn't seen Marla in years, not since their undergraduate days at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. Back then, Marla was the life of the room, the girl who danced on hostel tables and charmed her way through lectures without ever opening a textbook. Lena, ever the quiet contrast, had studied hard, dressed modestly, and prayed regularly. Somehow, they had become best friends. Opposites attracting, as the saying goes. So when Marla called out of the blue, her voice bursting with energy and complaints about Lagos stress, Lena's heart swelled. She imagined rekindled sisterhood, long talks over tea, laughter echoing through the living room. Marla said she needed a break, just a few weeks to breathe. She was between jobs, between relationships, between cities. Lena didn't hesitate. She offered the guest room. Greg smiled and agreed. That night, Lena prayed and thanked God for sending her an old friend to brighten their home. She had no idea that the same friend she welcomed with open arms would be the same person who would later turn her home into a theater of betrayal. But then again, betrayals never knock. They come in wearing familiar shoes, laughing with old memories, and sit comfortably at your table. And Marla, charming, unpredictable, dangerous Marla, slid into their home like a song Lena once loved, but had forgotten the lyrics to. She came with luggage, lipstick, and something else. Something Lena wouldn't see until it was far too late. Marla fit into the house like she had been carved for it. Within the first 2 days of her arrival, she had already memorized where everything was kept, from Lena's ceramic spice jars to Greg's favorite coffee mug. She brought her own flair into the space. Lavender candles on the bathroom sink, silk headwraps hanging loosely over door handles, jazz music drifting from her phone during evenings. Lena found it refreshing at first. After years of careful silence, the house now breathed with new energy. There was chatter over breakfast, old music playing while dinner cooked, random debates about politics and Nollywood dramas at night. Marla talked a lot, and her stories had a way of pulling you in, even if the truth inside them was often diluted. She talked about the job she left behind in Lekki, the man who ghosted her after a 2-month romance, the business idea she almost launched. Lena listened, sometimes with laughter, other times with concern, but always with the fondness of someone who believed this was still the girl who once sneaked Gary into hostel rooms with her. Greg, however, was harder to read. He warmed up to Marla fast, too fast, perhaps, but Lena didn't dwell on it. Greg had always been sociable. It wasn't strange for him to laugh loudly at jokes or share ideas over a bottle of malt. What Lena didn't catch, however, was how Greg's laughter with Marla came from somewhere deeper, like the laughter of someone remembering how it felt to be seen. And what Marla was doing, slowly, without a trace of shame, was making herself visible to Greg in ways Lena hadn't thought necessary in years. By the second week, Lena started to feel like a background character in her own home. Marla began cooking more often, spicy egusi with a recipe she swore was from her grandmother, fried plantain cut diagonally and crisped just right, meals served with drama and flair. Greg complimented every dish like a judge on a cooking show, and Marla received the praise like she'd been waiting for it all her life. One evening, Lena came home from the lab to find them singing along to an old Asa song while making yam porridge. Greg's hands were dusty with seasoning, Marla dancing beside him, eyes locked on his face. Lena stood by the doorway, smiling faintly, but her chest held something tight. She wasn't sure what to call it. Jealousy? Discomfort? Suspicion? It felt like a tiny crack in glass, too small to notice, but enough to threaten a shatter. Greg barely noticed her walk in. Marla greeted her with a joke about joining the house party, and Lena laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. That night, while brushing her teeth, she stared at her reflection and told herself she was just tired. Long hours in the lab could warp your thoughts. She believed this narrative, at least for a little while longer. What she didn't realize was that Marla wasn't just making herself at home. She was rewriting the rhythm of the household. She would hum while Greg scrolled through his phone, lean over his shoulder to read texts, playfully nudge him during conversations. Innocent movements, if you weren't looking too closely. But Lena, who had once trusted silence as safety, was now learning that not all quiet is calm. Some quiet means someone's holding their breath, waiting to strike. The subtle shifts became harder to ignore when Lena began coming home earlier than usual. Meetings finished ahead of schedule, power outages at the lab forced her to close early, coincidences that allowed her to catch small moments that didn't belong. One day, she walked in to find Marla wearing one of her wrappers, seated close to Greg on the couch. They jumped apart slightly when she entered, but not enough to raise alarm. Another evening, she overheard Marla giggling from the guest room, the kind of giggle people use when sharing secrets. Greg emerged seconds later, adjusting his shirt. Lena stood in the corridor, unseen, heart pounding. She wanted to believe she was overthinking, that maybe she had forgotten how friendships looked when you lived together. But even friendships had boundaries, and what she saw creeping into her space felt like vines growing around her throat. Greg started taking longer showers, locking his phone, and wearing cologne at home. He began commenting less on Lena's work, barely asking how her day went. He stopped praying with her at night, blaming fatigue or forgotten meetings. Lena, ever the analyst, began logging these shifts like data points in a hidden journal. She didn't ask questions. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she watched with the quiet precision of someone who had spent her life observing pathogens mutate. The same Lena who once believed God would shield her marriage was now slowly waking up to the realization that some infections start from within, quietly, before they spread to the bloodstream. Everything escalated one afternoon, when Lena forgot her work access badge and had to return home. She had left only 45 minutes earlier. Traffic had delayed her usual route, and the moment she stepped out of the car, something told her to walk, not ring the bell. She moved like a thief on her own property, stepping lightly, almost ashamed of her suspicion. But when she passed the living room window, time stopped. The curtain was half drawn, and inside, Greg sat with Marla curled beside him. They weren't touching, not yet, but the body language was unmistakable, close enough to collapse into one another. Greg leaned in and said something that made Marla grin, her hand resting gently on his knee. Lena could feel her heart climbing into her throat. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It whispered. It looked like comfort and wore her best friend's perfume. She didn't confront them. She didn't open the door. She walked back to her car, sat behind the steering wheel, and stared at the dashboard for what felt like hours. The pain sat beside her like an unwanted passenger. That night, she came home late, pretending traffic had held her. Marla acted normal, Greg too. They joked, they ate, and Lena smiled through it all. But something inside her had changed. The kind of change that doesn't speak, it waits. It watches. And when the time is right, it moves. Lena no longer saw Marla as a guest. She saw her as a wound she had let into her house. And Greg? He had become a man she didn't recognize, familiar in face, foreign in spirit. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the clouds were heavy, and the wind had started to howl. Lena's silence deepened, but it wasn't the type that came from surrender. It was the kind that formed in the belly of a storm, still gathering, watching. She didn't mention what she saw through the window that day. She didn't confront them or accuse either one. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices. Instead, she began to recalculate her movements with surgical precision. Her mornings stretched longer. She left home earlier than before, not because work demanded it, but because she no longer felt at ease in her own kitchen. Her return times became unpredictable, and every entrance was quiet and sudden, like a shadow slipping through cracks. She was no longer a wife in rhythm. She was a woman studying patterns. Lena began observing how Greg would always linger near the guest room after dinner, how Marla often wore lipstick at home, even when no plans had been made. She noticed how Greg rarely met her gaze during conversations anymore, and how Marla's laughter grew more restrained whenever she entered a room. There were moments Lena stood in the corridor just outside the guest room door, listening to muffled voices and occasional giggles, words just soft enough to keep secrets. She didn't need to hear everything. What her spirit couldn't confirm, her instincts had already gathered like receipts. There were too many coincidences, too many shared glances, unfinished statements, doors that opened and closed too quickly. She felt like a third party in her own house, a quiet stranger living under a roof built on new lies. But Lena knew herself too well to lash out blindly. She had learned long ago that some traps don't require speed, they require stillness. It was on one particularly warm afternoon in early November that Lena's patience began to splinter. She had left work early due to a systems outage at the lab. The electricity had cut out, the backup generator failed, and everyone was asked to go home while technicians scrambled for a fix. She didn't tell anyone she was heading back, not even Greg. As her taxi pulled into the compound, Lena instinctively asked the driver to wait. Something felt off. The gate was open, which was unusual. Marla's voice rang faintly through the hallway window, and Greg's voice followed, low and confident, coded in the tone he once reserved only for Lena. As she crept up to the front, keeping herself just out of view, she peered in through the slightly parted curtain. Marla was seated on Greg's lap, arms loosely draped around his neck, her slippers abandoned carelessly on the floor. Greg was laughing, his face not tense, not afraid, just comfortable. Lena's throat dried instantly, but her eyes stayed wide open. She didn't cry. She didn't blink. Her pain settled into her bones like dust on forgotten furniture. She stood there, watching them for what felt like an hour, memorizing every detail like a scientist documenting evidence. When Marla leaned forward and whispered something into Greg's ear, and he kissed her neck in return, Lena finally stepped back. She didn't want to see more. She had seen enough to poison a lifetime. She returned to the taxi without a word, sat upright, face still, and told the driver to take her to El Kahia Mall. She needed to be anywhere else, even if just for an hour, before returning home to pretend she hadn't just watched her life collapse in slow motion. Some betrayals don't scream when they land. They settle like a knife quietly pressed against the spine, no blood, just pain. That night, she served dinner as usual. Greg walked in from the bathroom, his shirt damp from the shower, and pecked her cheek with the same mouth that had kissed another woman just hours before. Marla joined them moments later, claiming to be exhausted, hair wrapped tightly in a scarf Lena had given her 2 birthdays ago. They ate quietly, interrupted only by the clink of cutlery. Greg asked about Lena's day, and she lied smoothly, talked about a meeting that didn't happen, a lab sample she never touched. Marla made a joke about Lena working too hard, and Lena smiled politely, nodding as if the world hadn't changed. After dinner, she washed the plates alone, her hands trembling slightly under the stream of water, but her face was blank, controlled. In bed, Greg reached for her, but she turned away, pretending to be asleep. As he pulled the covers over them both, Lena stared into the darkness with eyes wide open. She couldn't understand how a man could hold deceit so gently in his arms, how he could kiss her goodnight while carrying the scent of another woman in his hair. The hypocrisy was loud, but his footsteps were soft. That's what cut deepest. She would have preferred a slap, a fight, even an argument. Something loud. But instead, she had to sit through the quiet, eat dinner beside her enemy, share a bed with a traitor. And it was in that silence that Lena found something terrifying, clarity. She realized that trust isn't always broken in a single moment. Sometimes it erodes in layers like paint peeling off a once beautiful wall, until you can't remember what the color ever looked like. She turned toward the wall and let the silence cradle her until morning. From that night onward, Lena's world took on a strange stillness. She no longer questioned what she had seen. She no longer hoped to be wrong. She accepted the truth with the same discipline she had used to accept scientific results, no matter how devastating. But this wasn't research. This was her life, and the virus had spread into her bloodstream. She began moving differently. Her prayers deepened, not for salvation, but for strength. She still played the role of a devoted wife, still cooked, still smiled when neighbors waved. But behind that smile was a volcano wearing a dress. She had stopped looking for evidence because she already knew what was rotting under the floorboards. She listened closely to their movements now, noted every closed door, every suspicious silence. And the thing that haunted her most wasn't even the affair. It was how easily they lied to her face, day after day, without blinking. She would lie next to Greg and feel like a mannequin, touched only for performance. Marla had started wearing Lena's clothes without asking, and when Lena mentioned it once, she replied with a soft laugh, saying, "We're sisters now, ABI." Lena smiled back, but her insides tightened like fists. The audacity was insulting, the mockery too blatant to miss. Lena knew she couldn't hold this anger for long, not because she was weak, but because it was beginning to consume her thoughts, her energy, her breath. She could no longer focus at work, her hands shaking slightly during lab tests. She dropped a vial once and lied to her supervisor that it slipped. But nothing was slipping. It was all shattering. Every day she woke up and rehearsed forgiveness, but by nightfall, she wrote revenge letters in her head. And the worst part, she still loved Greg in pieces. Not whole anymore, just in fragments. Broken affection clinging to broken trust. It was a terrible thing to love a man who had become a stranger. Even worse to see that stranger every morning and call him husband. The days grew heavier. but Lena wore her patience like a long coat no one could see. It shielded her from reacting, from spilling, from giving them the satisfaction of knowing they had affected her. She still spoke softly, walked gracefully, and attended Sunday service like nothing had changed. But something had shifted in her silence, something deep and irretrievable. She began watching time differently. Every glance at the clock wasn't about her next meeting or prayer hour. It was about recording how long Marla stayed in the living room after she had excused herself, how long Greg took to respond when she called from another room. She noticed Greg had stopped using the lotion she bought him, and now used Marla's cocoa-scented cream. His excuses became more confident, his lies more polished. Lena no longer tried to catch him in them. It wasn't about confrontation anymore, it was about knowing. She understood now that betrayal wasn't always accidental. Some people planned their lives the way architects drew buildings, with careful precision, with intention, with pride. She started with drawing small details about her day. No more casual stories from the lab, no more asking about Greg's clients or checking if Marla needed anything. She moved like a ghost in a house that once belonged to her. The guest room door, once left open with friendliness, now stayed closed more often than not. She had stopped knocking. Lena began reading late into the night again, books that had nothing to do with science, memoirs of women who walked away from fire, poetry written by those who lived through betrayal and came out breathing. It was her way of preserving herself, even as the walls around her turned against her. It wasn't long before Lena realized they no longer feared getting caught. The small efforts to conceal had started slipping away. Greg had stopped pretending to keep distance from Marla. He now laughed more openly with her, even in Lena's presence. There was a night Marla danced barefoot across the living room while a song played from Greg's playlist, and he clapped and nodded, egging her on. Lena was on the other couch, holding her tea with both hands, watching this private play unfold in her living room like she was the unwanted guest. When Marla's wrapper loosened a bit too far and Greg looked a bit too long, Lena said nothing. Her silence was not weakness, it was an archive. She kept every moment like a photograph in her mind. One evening, Greg returned home late and Lena asked him, with no edge in her voice, where he had been. He replied calmly that he had drinks with old colleagues, even mentioned names. But Lena had seen Marla's story on WhatsApp. Greg's laugh caught in a boomerang, his hand resting too comfortably on Marla's back as they sat at a restaurant she had recommended to them months ago. When she saw it, Lena didn't blink. She simply downloaded it, saved it in a private folder on her phone, and deleted the chat. She began collecting these quiet confessions, the receipts, the photographs, the side glances, all of it filed away, not to confront, but to confirm. She stopped trusting her tongue and started trusting her eyes. What broke her wasn't the infidelity itself. It was the boldness, the utter lack of remorse. The ease with which they walked around her house, brushing against each other in doorways, laughing softly in corners, as if Lena were the inconvenience. And perhaps in their minds she was an obstacle, a wall they had to walk around to meet in the middle. But she wasn't a wall. She was a fuse, and soon someone would light it. By the time December arrived, Lena had become someone else entirely. Her body still responded to daily rituals. She cooked, she cleaned, she even sang along to church hymns while folding laundry. But her mind had moved into a darker room, one where the curtains were always drawn. She became surgical in her behavior, calculated. She no longer reacted to anything Greg said, not even when he forgot to come home one night and claimed his phone died while he was at a hotel presentation in ABA. She nodded and handed him his dinner. No questions. No suspicion. Just eerie stillness. Marla noticed the shift first. She started greeting Lena with more effort, complimenting her dress, offering to help more in the kitchen. It was fear dressed as kindness. Lena saw through it and let her pretend. One morning, Lena overheard them in the backyard. Their voices weren't passionate, but strategic. Greg asked if Marla had spoken to that agent, and if she had checked the place. Lena paused by the window and pressed her ear closer. It wasn't a one-night mistake. They were planning something, perhaps a life together, maybe even without her. She didn't cry. Instead, she whispered a verse from Psalms under her breath and began planning her next move. Not out of desperation, but from clarity. It was a strange thing to prepare for the unraveling of your life and still fold your clothes neatly. But Lena had always known how to remain composed. And now, the woman who once begged God for peace had started asking him for vengeance. Not loud, not bitter, just steady, like a whisper scratched into a concrete wall. She began setting the stage quietly. She called her cousin in Abuja, and asked if the research vacancy at their pharmaceutical firm was still open. She emailed her CV that evening, updated and polished. She began sorting her personal files into hard drives, cleared sensitive documents off the home laptop, and created a new email address Greg didn't know. She met with a real estate agent under the guise of helping a friend find a place. Every step she took was deliberate, gentle, hidden under her usual calm. On the surface, nothing had changed. But behind her eyes, everything was shifting. The most painful part of it all wasn't the lies or even the betrayal. It was the knowledge that Greg would never have confessed. He would have continued until he got caught, and maybe even after that, still insist it wasn't what it looked like. That cowardice, that refusal to own the truth, was what finally snapped the last rope in Lena's chest. She began to write again, not research papers or work reports, but pages filled with emotions she couldn't speak. Letters she never intended to send. One was to Greg, another to Marla. She kept them hidden under her clothes, sealed but unreadable to anyone else. She needed to bleed in silence before she struck. Greg had no idea what was coming. Neither did Marla. They thought Lena was fading. But she wasn't. She was waiting. And one thing life had taught her: when you corner a quiet woman, don't mistake her stillness for surrender. What you're watching isn't her giving up. It's her loading the final bullet. The night Lena told them she was traveling, the air inside the house felt too still, like something sacred was holding its breath. It was a Thursday evening, and she chose her moment carefully. After dinner, when Greg's stomach was full, and Marla had retreated into her usual self-absorbed silence, scrolling through her phone on the couch. Lena folded the last of the laundry, set the basket aside, and told Greg that her team had been invited to a government-organized biotech retreat in Enugu. She even pulled up a forged email on her phone, complete with a fake letterhead, official-sounding words, and an itinerary she'd typed out herself. Greg didn't ask too many questions. He nodded, said, "That's good, babe," and picked his teeth lazily. Marla, who always liked to act interested in Lena's career for show, raised her brows with a half-smile and asked how long she'd be gone. Lena responded calmly, 4 days, maybe 5. She left out just enough uncertainty to sound casual, but not suspicious. In truth, Lena wasn't going anywhere near Enugu. She had booked a small, quiet apartment off ABA Road under a different name, cash payment only. The owner was an old patient from a charity drive she had once volunteered for, a woman who didn't ask many questions and liked minding her business. That Friday morning, Lena packed light, just enough clothes for the lie to look believable. She took her laptop, a few lab files, and kissed Greg lightly before walking out the door. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't tremble. The time for feeling was over. What she was doing now didn't come from anger. It came from calculation. Once she arrived at the apartment, she placed her bag on the floor, drew the curtains, and sat in the armchair by the window for almost an hour doing nothing. Her phone buzzed twice, Greg, then Marla. She ignored both. They would assume she was in transit, or busy with welcome protocols. By evening, she had switched off her main line and activated a smaller phone she had bought weeks earlier. That one had only 2 numbers saved, her lawyer's and her cousin in Abuja. She spent that evening drafting emails, including a resignation letter she didn't plan to submit yet, and another message that she would send if things went the way she expected. Then she opened her photos folder and began sorting through every screenshot, every chat, every video clip that confirmed what she already knew. She arranged them all in a hidden folder on a flash drive and labeled it Research Archive. That night, she barely slept. Not because of fear, but because her mind kept running through every scene, every whisper, every kiss she never saw but could imagine with terrifying clarity. She thought about how many times Greg had touched her after touching Marla. How many nights Marla had worn her slippers, her scarf, her scent, pretending to be a sister while secretly mocking her behind closed doors. Lena had never known that betrayal could be so intimate, so quiet. But now, she no longer needed closure. What she wanted was the truth to land, loud and irreversible. She had arranged with her lawyer to meet at the house the next evening. She didn't give the full details, only said she had documents that required witnessing, and that she would explain everything once he arrived. It wasn't the confrontation she was preparing for, it was the unveiling. There was a difference. By Saturday morning, she returned home unexpectedly. She timed her arrival for just before noon, when the city hummed with weekend laziness and most people had dropped their guards. The bolt was still open when she turned the knob. The air inside was heavy with the scent of fried plantain and soft perfume. As she stepped into the hallway, The house was unusually quiet. No TV, no music. It was that kind of silence that warned you, like the sudden stillness before rain breaks. Lena moved carefully, her heels soft against the floor. Then she heard a sound, not from the kitchen, but from the bedroom. Her bedroom. The door was ajar. She walked slowly, not from hesitation, but from the strange calm that comes when you're no longer surprised. The voices were soft at first, almost affectionate. Greg said something about how this won't last long like this, and Marla laughed, saying she couldn't wait to be done pretending. That was all Lena needed to hear. She didn't need to see them wrapped around each other, or to hear more dirty promises. She pushed the door fully open, and stood in the doorway. Greg leapt up like a thief caught mid-act. Marla gasped, yanking the bedsheet around herself. They both looked ridiculous, mouths hanging open, frozen in disbelief. Lena didn't shout. She didn't throw anything. She simply looked at them, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her gaze to Greg and said, "You lied with your mouth, and she lied with her body. You both played a game I wasn't invited to. Now it's my turn." She walked back out, leaving the door wide open behind her. Her lawyer, punctual as ever, arrived 10 minutes later. The living room turned into a courtroom. Lena sat down calmly, brought out the folder labeled Research Archive, and handed it to her lawyer. Greg stood to the side, his shirt halfway buttoned, trying to act composed. Marla had disappeared into the guest room, still wrapped in the sheet like it could hide her shame. Lena looked at her husband one last time, then spoke with clarity. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't uncertain. She told the lawyer to begin the process for a separation, with every documented infidelity attached as evidence. The lawyer nodded, opened his file, and began taking notes. Greg tried to interject, mumbling things about misunderstandings, needing time to talk, but Lena cut him off. "Don't explain. You used up all your chances when you started scheduling dates with my best friend while sleeping in my bed." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her silence had done enough damage. After the lawyer left, she packed her essentials in one small suitcase. She didn't even touch the wardrobe. Let them keep the house. Let them sit in the echo of what they had destroyed. Before leaving, she paused by the mirror in the hallway, the same one she had checked every morning before heading to work. For the first time in weeks, she saw a woman who wasn't broken anymore, just empty and strangely free. Then she walked out into the sunlit street without looking back. The door didn't slam. It clicked, like a final line in a book that didn't need a sequel. Lena didn't look back after she left. Not at the house, not at Greg, not even at the woman who had once been her best friend. She didn't cry in the taxi. She didn't explain to the curious driver why she was carrying just one suitcase, dressed in all black like someone heading to a funeral. Maybe in a way she was, not for someone else, but for the life she had buried behind her. The apartment she had arranged off ABA Road was small, quiet, and smelled of wood polish and lemon-scented insecticide. She entered and stood in the center of the room, breathing in the silence. It wasn't the heavy silence of betrayal or tension. It was peace, new and still fragile. She sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of the previous hours sink into her shoulders. It wasn't relief she felt. It was numbness. A vast space in her chest where something used to live, trust, maybe, or love, or belief in the kind of partnership she thought she had. She lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above her, its blades creaking like an old secret. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel vindicated. What she felt was something closer to balance. Not happiness, not revenge. Just the steady knowledge that she had done what needed to be done. She didn't burn the house down. She didn't destroy anyone's career. She simply left, and took her peace with her. The days that followed were quiet, but not lonely. Lena re-entered her life like someone walking into a familiar room after years away. She started working remotely while finalizing her relocation paperwork. The firm in Abuja had responded positively. Her cousin had spoken to the board, and an offer letter arrived via email 3 days after she left Greg. She didn't celebrate. She packed slowly. One suitcase turned to 2. She folded her clothes with the precision of someone putting away the past one shirt at a time. She didn't bother telling anyone in Port Harcourt she was leaving. Not her church, not her neighbors, not even her colleagues at the institute. A formal resignation would come later. For now, she wanted space, air, silence. She read books in the evenings, drank tea on the balcony while watching children play below, and listened to the sound of generators humming like lullabies in the distance. She got calls from Greg, missed ones, unanswered. He sent messages that swung between apology and denial, like a man drowning who couldn't decide whether to swim or sink. Marla sent one message, just one. I didn't plan this. I didn't mean to hurt you. Lena read it once, deleted it, and never replied. Some things don't deserve closure. Some stories don't get a final discussion. When someone chooses betrayal, they forfeit the right to explain themselves. Lena had learned this in silence, through every quiet wound and hidden bruise. She no longer needed words. Her absence spoke louder than anything she could write back. One evening, as she stood by her window in the apartment, watching the streetlights blink one by one across the darkening sky, she felt something shift inside her. Not pain this time. Not anger. Just an understanding. People don't always show you who they are with their hands. Sometimes they show you with their comfort, what they're willing to destroy while still feeling safe. Greg had felt safe while betraying her. Marla had laughed and danced in Lena's kitchen knowing full well what she was doing. That comfort, that shamelessness, was what finally healed her. She stopped blaming herself. Stopped asking where she had failed. She didn't fail. She was just surrounded by people who mistook her patience for permission. And when she removed herself, everything they thought they controlled fell apart. Greg lost not just his wife, but his image. Word spread eventually, not by Lena's doing, but by consequence. People noticed. His smile faded. His clients pulled back. Marla, from what Lena heard through quiet whispers, eventually moved back to Lagos, unable to cope with the whispers that followed her everywhere in town. But Lena didn't rejoice in their misfortune. She didn't keep tabs. She had no interest in watching their story crash. She was too busy building a new one for herself, quietly, slowly, with careful hands and a steady heart. On the day she left Port Harcourt for good, the sky was gray, swollen with unshed rain. Her taxi driver was a woman this time, middle-aged, soft-spoken, and respectful of Lena's quiet. As they drove past familiar roads, Lena didn't feel nostalgia. She felt gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it gave her. She arrived at the airport, boarded the flight with nothing in her eyes but calm. She landed in Abuja hours later and stepped into her new apartment, one with taller windows, thicker walls, and no ghosts. She unpacked slowly that evening, unwrapping not just her belongings, but her own soul. There was no big welcome. No fireworks. Just her reflection in the mirror, older, wiser, but still standing. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the city breathe. In that moment she smiled, not because she was happy, but because she was finally free. And sometimes, freedom doesn't look like laughter or celebration. Sometimes it looks like silence with no tension, a meal eaten without a lie, a night spent in peace. Lena didn't need to be anyone's wife, savior, or victim anymore. She had returned to herself. And this version of her would never again be so easily deceived. Not by soft hands, sweet voices, or borrowed love. She was done being polite to betrayal. From now on, she would walk with her eyes wide open, and her heart locked behind a door only truth could open. Sometimes the deepest kind of betrayal comes not from strangers, but from the people we once called home. But let this story remind you, your peace is not tied to people who break you and call it love. You don't have to shout to be strong, and you don't need to get even to win. Just like Lena, choose yourself. Protect your sanity. And when you walk away, don't walk with bitterness, walk with wisdom. Healing isn't loud, but it is powerful. Don't be afraid to start over. Peace of mind is more valuable than any apology that comes too late. May your heart never be a home for hidden pain. May your eyes see the truth before your spirit is wounded. May you never be surrounded by people who smile with you, but plot against you. Where your trust has been broken, may God restore your joy in full. Where your name has been disrespected, may honor return to you double. If you're walking through heartbreak right now, may strength rise in your silence. May peace wrap itself around you like a warm cloth, and may wisdom be your guide. May the next chapter of your life be soft, secure, and soaked in genuine love. And when the time comes to let go, may you walk boldly with no regrets. If you believe it, type or say, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.